All right, let's open our Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians 15, and I will meet you right over there in just a moment. As today we conclude our talks together by thinking about evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Before I get into that material, I want to thank all of you for being so kind and welcoming. This is a hospitable congregation. I can tell that. There's a loving atmosphere here. There's a dedication to the truth. And I'm so thankful to just be a small part of the work here at this time and pray that it will continue and grow in strength and in number as the years go by. And so it's just an awesome thing for me to get to be a part of this in a small way. For me, it's an awesome thing. I mean, coming from so far away and meeting you all and holding you in my heart as I go back, it means a lot to me. So I'm very thankful for that. And I want to say that the lunch was tremendous, and I liked the Filipino food. I appreciate that very much. I don't know if I've ever had it before, but it was good. Do you think I should go home and ask my wife if she could learn to cook one of those? That might be a good idea. She might say, why don't you learn to cook one of those? So maybe one of us will have to learn how, because that was tremendous. When we have friends, family, classmates, co-workers who ask us why we're Christians, at some point, it's got to come back to the idea that Jesus was raised from the dead, because that is God's vindication of the radical claims to divinity that Jesus made. Jesus had a radical sense that he was God and that everybody on the planet was accountable to him to do what he said. And of course, the Jews who were opposed to him, not all Jews were opposed to him, but the Jewish leadership, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, the Herodians, the people who were opposed to Jesus, thought that that was blasphemous. But if Jesus was vindicated by God by raising him from the dead after he had been killed because of his claims, well, then everybody must do what Jesus says. So the whole of Christianity really hinges on whether Jesus was raised from the dead or not. If somebody asks you, how do you know that that really did occur, then our answer should never be, if we're talking to a skeptical person, our answer should never be merely, well, I believe it because it feels good to me. Or, and I don't think it's a sin to sing this song, but I don't mind telling you, it's one of my least favorite songs. The song that says, you ask me how I know he lives, and what's the answer in the song? He lives within my heart. Well, I hope he lives within your heart, and it's good for him to live within your heart, so it's not wrong to say he lives within your heart, but that's not a good answer to give to a skeptical person, because Muhammad lives in people's hearts, the Hindu gods live in people's hearts, Allah and all kinds of different religious ideas take place in people's hearts. That doesn't make them true. So we need to give publicly available reasons. That is, reasons that any rational person could be expected to believe. I've been teaching at North Jackson a course over the last year, I guess, approximately, on some Christian apologetics issues, and I post the slides in a Dropbox folder every week. So far, we've only talked about the existence of God, but we're beginning to talk about the resurrection of Jesus and an extended argument for it, presenting a lot of evidence. And if you would like to have access to that folder, then there's a lot of information in there that's not original with me, but every week, every Wednesday night when I teach the class, I put my slides in that folder. And I have pretty detailed slides with a lot of quotations and a lot of arguments and so forth. And we also put the audio from those classes. I put my iPhone down there and hit record so you can hear the audio. If you would like that, then just email me and I'll put you on the folder and you can have access to all that the people in the class have. My email is calebcolley@gmail.com, calebcolley@gmail.com, and just say, give me access to the folder, and I will add you to that so you can have it. But let's notice at the outset here the significance of the resurrection from 1 Corinthians 15, and then we'll try to give the publicly available reasons why any rational person ought to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. Notice, when we say any rational person, that's not any rational person who believes in God. It's not any rational person who's already sympathetic to Christianity. It's just any rational person. Okay. 1 Corinthians 15:3 says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures." And then if you turn to verses 5 and 6, you find that if it's not true that Jesus was raised from the dead, we're even found to be misrepresenting God. This should be 15 and 16. "Because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Jesus have perished in Christ. If in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied." So Paul says, if Jesus is not raised from the dead, we're wasting our life. Christ can't save us. We're pitiable as Christians if this really did not happen historically. You see, Paul believed that the resurrection was not a symbol of hope. It does provide hope, but it's not just a symbol of hope. He did not believe that the resurrection is like a metaphor, or is the idea that every cloud has a silver lining, or something like that, or that there is joy after sorrow. Paul believed that it was a fact of history, and that Christianity was built on that fact. Then you turn over to verses 17 and 18, and you observe that Jesus was seen after he was dead by Cephas, then by the 12. After that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that, he was seen by James, then by all of the apostles. Then last of all, he was seen by me also, as one born out of due time. Paul says, as one born out of due time here in verse 8. I'm sorry, I got the headings mixed up there. I don't know what happened there, but he was seen by me also. The New Testament lists 12 different appearances of Jesus. Some of them Paul mentions here after he was dead. So Paul says, many of the people who saw Jesus are still alive, and you can go check with them, and they knew Jesus had died and that he was later resurrected. So there's Paul's claim about the significance of the resurrection. Well, how would you argue that this is a fact of history? You would argue for it based on the same way that you would argue that any facts of ancient history really describe actual historical events. And that's by making an appeal to the best explanation for the historical facts that we have. I know this might seem a little bit technical, but when historians go to try to determine what really happened, they look at the facts that are known, and then they say, what are the best explanations for the facts that we indeed have? Well, in the case of the resurrection, there are 4 generally accepted historical facts surrounding the resurrection, which are widely accepted by New Testament historians, whether they believe in the resurrection or not. So 4 facts that historians generally accept, even if they don't think the resurrection occurred, even if they're not Christians, even if they don't believe in the inspiration of the Bible, even if they believe the Bible has mistakes in it, they still believe that these 4 things happened. Now, what are the 4 things? Number 1, after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried in a private tomb, and many scholars would say it was Joseph of Arimathea who buried Jesus, because Joseph of Arimathea is an unlikely invention. Why would Christians make up, if they're making up a story about Jesus being buried, why would they make up a hero who gives Jesus an honorable burial, who was part of the organization that engineered the judicial murder of Jesus, namely the Jewish Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin? It doesn't make sense that the Christians would say, of all the people who could have buried Jesus, it was this Jewish person who was on the court that condemned Jesus. So most scholars are willing to say, yes, Jesus was buried after his crucifixion, and it was Joseph of Arimathea who buried him. No competing burial story exists. You've got the burial story told in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and there's no other account in ancient history of what happened to the body of Jesus. There's just what the Gospels say. Notice here that the reason people believe in this first fact is because it is multiply attested in a variety of ancient sources. True, these sources were eventually collected into what we call the New Testament. But these are just ancient Greek documents, and you do not have to view them as being the inspired, inerrant Word of God, which they are. You don't have to ascribe inerrancy or inspiration to these books in order to look at them as the best record we have of what happened to the body of Jesus, or what happened after Jesus died, or what Jesus was like when He lived. Scholars are well ready to accept that the New Testament is a generally reliable historical record of what happened with Jesus. Why? Because there are multiple sources with multiple background information, like the source that Matthew used for his gospel, the source that Mark used. You could say it was all just directly from the Holy Spirit. That's fine, but historians look at these texts and say, where did Mark get his information? Where did Matthew get his information? All these are written within a generation after when Jesus lived. Where did John get his information? When Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15 about the burial of Jesus, he implies that Jesus was buried in this text. He says that He was buried. The death, burial, and resurrection, those are the three basic facts of the gospel that he mentions. Where did Paul get his information? Well, Paul says it was handed on to him. He said he received this from early Christians. So this is a tradition that goes back before Paul. So scholars are willing to say, look, these are independent, multiple sources that tell what happened to the body of Jesus. So even if we don't believe this text is from God, we have to accept, because they're all telling the same story, that the best evidence for what happened to Jesus is what these books say. So they're willing to accept this fact, that after the crucifixion, Jesus was buried. They are also willing to accept that on the Sunday after Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty. That's not a miracle for there to be an empty tomb. None of these four facts is a miracle. None of these four facts is that Jesus was actually raised from the dead by God. It's just the fact that women followers of Jesus went to the tomb and discovered that it was empty. You got to explain that somehow. Again, we're going to get to the best explanation is the one we should believe. The one that best accounts for the historical facts that are accepted is the explanation we should believe. Now here scholars will say, again, it's multiply attested by a variety of sources. You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the sermons in the book of Acts, and then you have the attestation in the epistles of Paul that the tomb was found empty. So, given the fact that when the Christian message began to be proclaimed in Jerusalem, nobody paraded his corpse around the city and said, these Christians are saying that Jesus was raised from the dead, but here's His body. When Peter got up on the day of Pentecost and preached that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, nobody said, Peter, you're crazy, because He's in His tomb. Maybe you disciples went to the wrong tomb, but we know where He's buried. The fact that Joseph and Nicodemus petitioned Pilate for the body of Jesus to bury it shows that His burial site was known to Jew and Gentile alike. All of the Christians, all of the people who opposed Christianity knew where the tomb of Jesus was. It was public knowledge. And so to preach about Jesus being raised from the dead in the same city where He was killed and buried would to be invite embarrassment, because the body would have been producible. So here we have a second historical fact, the empty tomb. Again, not a miracle. A tomb can be found empty without a resurrection having occurred, but it is one of the historical facts that has to be accounted for. The third, and I wanted to read a quotation along these lines before I get to the third. Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist in the resurrection, wrote, by far, most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. So that is a fact that requires explanation. The third one is, on various occasions, different individuals and groups had experiences of a post-mortem Jesus. That is, they thought they saw Jesus. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul has already listed, as we read a moment ago, a number of those experiences. This need not be a miracle people could think they see something that they don't see. Somebody potentially could have a hallucination or what might be considered a visionary experience, but it is a historical fact. Nobody can deny that people thought that they had these experiences. Again, multiple attestation from all of the sources that underlie the Gospels, Paul's account, and that is very good evidence, as we're going to see in a moment, that Jesus really did appear to all these people. They sincerely thought that they saw Jesus after he was in the grave. And there is nothing in the psychological case books that matches what this is, where different individuals and groups, sometimes large groups, all saw Jesus and all believed that they had experienced the glorified Lord. Not merely somebody who was in Abraham's bosom and who was appearing to them as Jewish expectations might have dictated, but that they saw him bodily raised from the dead. Okay, so that's the third historical fact. The fourth historical fact, and I'll get to that, but let me read from Gert Ludemann. I don't want to skip some material that I need to show. He opposes the resurrection. He doesn't believe Jesus was raised from the dead, but he says it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. So here's a prominent theologian who disbelieves in the resurrection, but he says, yes, you can't deny people had experiences of the risen Lord. So the fourth fact is that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe in the resurrection despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Their predisposition to disbelieve in the resurrection is seen in the Gospels. In Mark 8 and 9, for example, Jesus explained to his disciples that he was going to suffer and die, and 3 days again he would rise from the dead, and they didn't understand what he was talking about. And then even after he was raised from the dead, that Sunday night, he was critical of them because they didn't believe the testimony of the women who had gone to the tomb. These were not people who were looking to find Jesus. These were people who didn't think they would see Jesus. And part of the reason they didn't think they would see Jesus is in Judaism, and this has been well established by the work of N.T. Wright, and we'll hear from him, I think, in just a minute. But N.T. Wright has shown, and we don't believe everything that N.T. Wright says. He's not a member of the church, and he wouldn't give you the right plan of salvation and so forth, but he wrote an 850-page book to really prove one point about the resurrection, and that is that Jews did not expect one person to rise from the dead to glory and immortality prior to the end of the world. They thought everybody would rise from the dead at the end of the world, but they did not expect one guy in the middle of human history to rise from the dead and then to be glorified and go live immortally with God forever. That was not on their horizon. They had Daniel 12, about the resurrection of everyone at the end. They had Job 14 and 19, but they did not interpret Psalm 16 and Psalm 110 as being prophecies about Jesus being raised from the dead to glory and immortality in the middle of history. They didn't think in those terms. So the only thing that would have changed their mind to where they would worship Jesus as the glorified Lord is if he really was raised from the dead. So they suddenly and sincerely switched from believing that a person would not be raised from the dead to worshiping Jesus as the risen Lord. That's a historical fact that has to be explained. So what would explain all four of these historical facts? Well, the resurrection does it perfectly. If Jesus was bodily raised from the dead, then all four of these facts make perfect sense. But what I want to do in the next few minutes as we wrap up is just to say there is no other theory that has won any widespread scholarly consensus. There is nothing on the table. There is no explanation that is non-miraculous that people have offered that accounts for these four facts. Notice what Luke Johnson says. Some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. So here's a theologian at Emory University, very prominent theologian, who says something had to happen to change these people's minds, to get them to move from, for example, worshiping primarily on Saturday as the Sabbath, which they had kept holy for generations, to worshiping on Sunday as the day when Jesus was resurrected from the dead. What a huge change from preaching that people ought to obey Moses, which they had preached for generations, to suddenly saying the way to be saved is to follow Jesus. That's a huge change. Or what about J.P. Moreland? He says the disciples had nothing to gain by lying and starting a new religion. They faced hardship, ridicule, hostility, and martyrs' deaths. In light of this, they could never have sustained such unwavering motivation if they knew what they were preaching was a lie. People will die for false causes that they get deceived into believing, but people do not die for lies that they made up themselves. Doesn't make any sense. Or N.T. Wright, as I mentioned, says, that is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. So remember, you got to explain all the facts. And the facts include the empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus, and the disciples' sudden conversion, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. What can explain that other than the resurrection? People in the last 200 years have really tried to give an alternate view. For example, D.F. Strauss said that the witnesses were hallucinating. He said people thought they saw Jesus, but it was just a hallucination. Well, let's say we grant that. As I said, there is no psychological basis for assuming that. For one reason, people don't hallucinate in groups, just like people don't dream in groups. You know, you haven't woken up and talked to your wife about the dream you had last night and have her say, oh yes, I was in there, I remember exactly, I was there with you, it was the same dream. No, you don't dream together and you don't hallucinate together. Furthermore, if you hallucinate, you only hallucinate things that you potentially could believe. And Jews, as I said, did not believe in a resurrection in the middle of history to glory and immortality. I mean, they knew that that guy had been resurrected when he touched Elisha's bones in 2 Kings 13, but that was a resuscitation to die again. That person would not live forever with a glorified body. I mean, they knew that Lazarus had been raised from the dead, but that was not a resurrection to glory and immortality. That was a resuscitation. He came back to life, but it was to die again. This is Jesus coming back as the glorified Lord to immortality, to ascend back into heaven and to reign. That was something they would not have thought of. If they had had a vision of Jesus, they would have assumed that he was in Abraham's bosom and that he was just appearing to them, rather like Moses and Elijah appearing on the Mount of Transfiguration. They didn't think Moses and Elijah had been resurrected from the dead bodily. They were appearing there, but see, Jews didn't have on their horizon this resurrection. So even if they had seen Jesus, they wouldn't have thought of it in terms of the resurrection as the New Testament describes it. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that they did hallucinate and see Jesus and he really hadn't been raised from the dead. Does that do anything to explain the empty tomb? It doesn't explain that. So even if you say that explains the experience, it doesn't explain the empty tomb. And so remember, any explanation we give has to explain all the facts. Otherwise, you're going to have to come up with some kind of ad hoc explanation and combine various explanations that don't fit together. I heard of one theologian in another place who said, well, a resurrection is not a good explanation because that's a miracle. We don't want to believe in a miracle. So what we'll say instead is that Jesus had a previously unknown twin brother. And after Jesus was killed, this twin brother who had fled to Egypt as a child or something, he had been taken away. He just appeared and said, I'm Jesus raised from the dead, and everybody believed it. Well, you see how ridiculous that is. Whenever somebody makes a proposal like that, the answer we should give is, what evidence is for that? What supports that? Do you have any documentation from ancient history that gives us any indication that this actually occurred? And the answer for those types of ad hoc theories is, there is no evidence. So, the disciples were hallucinating? Well, let's just say we grant that. It doesn't explain the empty tomb. Because the first time a disciple said, everybody ought to be a Christian because I saw Jesus, what would the Romans do? What would the Jews do? They would parade Jesus' corpse around the city and say, he's still dead. Nobody better believe this. I mean, if you're a Jew in the first century and your favorite Messiah got himself killed, then you had two choices. You could either go home or you could get yourself another Messiah. This happened a lot. There were a bunch of people, like Gamaliel talks about in Acts 5, there were a bunch of people who thought they were the Messiah. And a lot of them got themselves killed. And every time, without fail, their movements dissipated. People stopped believing in him. The only time that a Messiah got himself killed, and then just days later, everybody was saying, he's raised from the dead, and I'm willing to die for him. The only time that ever occurred is with Jesus. And that's because his appearance was not just a hallucination. But another theory that's been offered is that Jesus' body was stolen. That the disciples sort of deceived everybody. They somehow got past the deadly killer, trained, mighty Roman guards who were guarding the tomb, broke in there, and took Jesus' body away, and then claimed that Jesus had been raised from the dead. The stolen body theory is actually the first explanation that was given by the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities. They conspired on it in Matthew 28, 13 to 15. Remember, the Jews paid off the Roman guards to say that while they were sleeping, Jesus' disciples stole the body, which is a pretty funny explanation to say, we were asleep, and let us tell you exactly what happened while we were asleep. To say that people were conked out and they were sort of somehow knowing what was done while they were asleep is preposterous. But that was the argument they gave. That was the first way of trying to naturalistically explain the resurrection with no miracles. Does that argument work? It will not work because the disciples so sincerely believed in Jesus' resurrection that they were willing to die for it. This is the only explanation, by the way, that even attempts to explain all of the facts. The empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus, and the sudden conversion of the disciples. But even then, you have to conjoin it with some other theory to explain the appearances. If they just stole the body, then how did people see him? That would be some kind of a trick that would have to be played, or they would have to have some kind of a visionary experience. So even then, there has to be some sort of added theory. So I guess I should say it doesn't really attempt to explain them all, because you have to have some type of explanation for the appearances. So that theory won't work. Not anybody really, there are no scholars who really support that view today. Then the view that the disciples went to the wrong tomb has been proposed. The assumption is that everybody involved sort of had collective amnesia about where Jesus' body was located. Even though everybody at the beginning of the story knew where the tomb was, by the end of the story they had all been forgotten. So there was an empty tomb, but the disciples went to the wrong one. It wasn't Jesus' tomb that was found empty. But of course, this does nothing to explain why nobody produced the body. So this has been a very weak theory that has won no adherents, really. Then we find the other theory, the last one I guess that I'll mention, is that Jesus did not die on the cross, that he just swooned, and so somehow he survived the crucifixion and then woke up in the tomb, came out of a coma 3 days later. That's problematic because the stone was so big that even at least four grown women who were on their way to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus on that early Sunday morning didn't think they would be able to remove the stone themselves. So if at least four grown women are wondering how they could remove the stone, do you think that an emaciated body of Jesus, having lost all that blood, would be able to move that stone? Having come to within an inch of death and then to lay in the tomb with no nourishment for 36 hours, would he be in a position to move that stone himself? Surely not. And then if somehow he did, and he came to the disciples, would they say, "Oh, you're the glorified Lord. Praise the Lord, you have risen from the dead"? No, they would say, "We got to take you to the doctor. You need medical treatment right away because you've been so badly beaten up, and we don't know how you survived, but somehow you didn't die." Nobody said that. And actually, nobody in the ancient world came up with this theory that Jesus only swooned. It's amazing that if this were the best response from an atheistic perspective or a naturalistic perspective, why didn't anybody propose this in the first century? Nobody even thought of it. In the Journal of the American Medical Association, this is an article from 1986, I believe, it says, clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and supports the traditional view that the spear thrust between his right rib probably perforated not only the right lung but also the pericardium and heart, and thereby ensured his death. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. So modern medical knowledge, combined with all the history we have about Roman crucifixion, proves that Jesus really did die on the cross, contrary to our Muslim friends who say that Jesus did not die on the cross. No, he really did. The last one, I do have one more, and that is that the resurrection is a legend. Some people have said Jesus died on the cross, but the idea that he came back from the dead is something that Christians made up hundreds of years later because they loved Jesus so much that they thought the story about Jesus would just be enhanced by saying that Jesus came back from the dead. So they wanted to promote their cause, and the best way to convince people to be Christians would be to make up even grander and grander stories about Jesus, including that he was resurrected from the dead. So the legend hypothesis is that Jesus was a mere mortal. Let's see, is my clicker going to go? There we go. And that Christians loved Jesus so much that they made up a story, kind of like Robin Hood. So in the stories about Robin Hood, we know that there probably was somebody who was sort of like what we think of as Robin Hood, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. But there have been increasingly ornate legends made up about him. So what was Robin Hood, the historical figure, really like? Well, we don't know very much about that. It's probably that there was somebody like it, but not somebody who did all of the grand things that are associated with Robin Hood now. That's kind of the legend hypothesis, as it's said about Jesus, is that, well, there was a guy, Jesus of Nazareth, he really was crucified, but the whole thing about the resurrection and Jesus doing miracles, all of that is legendary. That's what a lot of people think about Jesus. So, where did that legend come from? There are only about 3 sources to account for legends that could have accumulated about Jesus. Well, one would be Christianity. Christians could have come up with it, but the problem with that is the resurrection is baked into the very beginning of Christianity. Even the first few days after Jesus was resurrected from the dead, Christians were already talking about it. The book of Acts has sermons that were preached in the generation that was still alive while Jesus was alive when people were talking about it. So it was not something that could have accumulated that quickly. Christians believed in the resurrection from day one. So it didn't come from Christianity. We've already said it couldn't come from Judaism because the Jews didn't believe in that. They didn't have any notion that there would be a person who would be raised from the dead. The disciples themselves did not understand it as faithful Jews. So it didn't come from Judaism. Some have said it came from pagan mythology, that there were polytheistic religions that had dying and rising gods. So at some point, early Christian Jews who had sort of imbibed ideas from pagan mythology just made up a resurrection to go along with what they had heard from pagan myths, from Dionysus, Osiris, gods like that. Is that possible? Well, it's not. And just as we wrap up today, let me observe that the Gospels are not written as mythology or legend, and the Gospels are Jewish documents that have to be studied with the background of Judaism in mind. So anytime we look at the Gospels, we have to say, what would Judaism have allowed these Jews to say? And they were opposed to pagan myths. Look at what Gary Habermas says. He's the chair of the philosophy department at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. And he says, there is no known case of a mythical deity in the mystery religions where we have both clear and early evidence that a resurrection was taught prior to the late 2nd century AD, obviously much later than the Christian message. So it's over 100 years after the resurrection was initially taught that we have any record of these pagan legends saying things about resurrection. And they were fertility religions. So when they talked about resurrection, it was always a symbol for the crops for the crop cycle where you have death and rebirth, like death at the end of the year, and then in the springtime, a rebirth. So it's about the change of the seasons. And so all of the resurrections in these pagan myths had to do with farming. And they were just word pictures to help you see the crop cycle. It did not have to do with an individual human being dying and then coming back from the dead. Habermas continues, further, the mystery gods were not even historical persons. This is certainly in contrast to the early Christian insistence that its beliefs have solid factual underpinnings. So Habermas says, the resurrection in the Gospels is totally different from these pagan myths. And then one more thing, I'm going to read from C.S. Lewis on this point, because Lewis points out that the Gospels are of a literary quality that is different from any other writings, especially legendary writings from that period. And Lewis is going to observe that they are written in a style that is very detailed and is much more like modern fiction. Because modern fiction gives you a lot of details. And ancient legends did not do this. I mean, in modern fiction, you read about somebody waking up in the morning, and it might say something like he looked at his alarm clock, and it glowed softly in the room, and he reached over and he punched the button on the alarm clock, and then he slowly opened his eyes. You know, very small details to give the illusion of reality, to help you feel like you're really there with the person. That's modern fiction. But ancient legends did not do this. So look at what Lewis says. He says, I have been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, and myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know that none of them are like this. None of them are like the Gospels. Of this Gospel text, there are only two possible views. Either this is historical reportage, or else some unknown ancient writer, without known predecessors or successors, suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic realistic narrative. The reader who doesn't see this has simply not learned how to read. So Lewis says, if you think that the Gospels are just some adaptation of legends, you don't know what legends are like. And the legends are not written in the detailed, realistic style of these gospel accounts. So the only category in which to put them is ancient biography. These are not legends. These are historical reportage. And if they are historical reportage, then this option of saying that the resurrection is just a legendary hoax that Christians perpetrated on the world is off the table. So what have we done? We've said there are 4 historical facts about Jesus. Any explanation has to account for all the facts. The resurrection does account for all those facts. There are some other hypotheses, the wrong tomb theory, the swoon theory, the legend theory, the conspiracy theory where the disciples stole the body, but none of them accounts for all 4. And the one that's most popular today is this last one, that the resurrection is just a legend, that it's a myth that has been foisted on to the historical data about Jesus. But people who study myths and who study ancient Judaism say what the Gospels say about Jesus is un-Jewish. And Jesus comes from a Jewish background. The Gospels are written almost entirely from a Jewish perspective, and they have to be read that way. And they hated these pagan myths. They despised them. They believed they were against God. They would never have adapted from pagan mythology to make up a story about their hero. It just goes the wrong way. So what are we left with? People who deny the resurrection today do not deny it because they've got a better explanation of those 4 facts. They deny it because they don't want to believe it, and maybe because they don't believe in God. See, if you believe in a miracle-working God who created the world just by speaking it, then Him raising Jesus from the dead is no big deal. It's not hard at all for a God who can create a universe to bring His Son back from the dead. So whether you believe in the resurrection is going to come down to how open you are to the existence of God. If you're open to it, and you should be, because we have so many good arguments that God exists. The argument from the existence of the universe, which came into being, according to scientists today, the universe came into being out of nothing. But nothing doesn't cause anything. So we should believe that there was a supernatural being who brought it into existence. We have the argument from morality, that we have objective moral values and duties that animals do not have. There's no accounting for it apart from a divine lawgiver. We have the argument from intentional states of consciousness. We have thoughts that are about things, but cells and tissues aren't about things. They don't have intentionality. But if we're just molecules in motion, if we're just moist robots, then we shouldn't have intentionality. We shouldn't have free will. We shouldn't have consciousness. We should just be cells and tissues. Well, we could go on, but we have arguments to prove that God exists. And if God exists, and the best explanation for these historical facts is that God did something, then why wouldn't we just go ahead and accept that the resurrection did occur? It is the best explanation. The question is, are you willing to accept it and then accept what it implies? Because the resurrection implies that Jesus has authority over you to tell you what to do. That's a harsh reality for somebody who's never thought of a man who lived 2,000 years having the right to tell them what to do. To say, thou shalt and thou shalt not. But that's the claim of the New Testament. And Christianity will not allow us to say anything other than Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And nobody can get to the Father, nobody can go to heaven except through Him. But if that's true, isn't that what you want to hear? Do you want to compromise that in any way? Because if it is the only way to get to God, to be a Christian, then love would dictate that somebody tell you, you got to be a Christian. And you've got to be faithful. So maybe you need to make a change and be right with God today. If we can assist you in that in any way, please come right now as together we stand and while we sing.